for a few seconds about the difference between nanoparticles and ultrafine particles. We talk about ultrafine particles as the particles that are the product mostly of combustion. Those are the particles that we include in the measurements of PM 2.5. And nanoparticles could be the result of that combustion or could be engineered nanoparticles. And we'll talk about that in 2 seconds. But a nanoparticle is a small particle that ranges between 1 and 100 nanometers in size. And the important thing of nanoparticles is that they exhibit significantly different physical and chemical properties to their larger material counterparts. Most nanoparticles are indeed made up of only a few hundred atoms. Ultrafine PM are the result of combustion fuels. And you should know that all fuels, regardless, produce ultrafine particles. Nanomaterials. So, what are nanomaterials? Why are we interested here in the engineered nanomaterials? Well, we're interested because we're also inhaling those. And those nanomaterials, engineered for other purposes, are getting into your brain. So, when we talk about nanomaterials, we can include carbon-based nanomaterials, metal-based materials, dendrimers, composites, etc. Electrical, catalytic, magnetic, mechanical, thermal, or imaging features are the ones that are pursued when the factories make nanomaterials. And the applications are widely in commercial, medical, military, and environmental sectors. This is a cartoon taken from a journal called Nanomaterials. And what I want you to see is the difference in the sizes and the shapes of those man-made nanoparticles. They could be carbon-based or silica-based or metal-based, and the metal-based nanoparticles are of deep interest to us because we have seen them in the brain and they accumulate in certain areas of the brain like the substantia nigra and the cerebellum. And so for the purpose of this wider range of nanomaterials, it's important that we are familiar with the shape and the characteristics of these nanomaterials because one simple reason. Those engineered nanoparticles are also entering your brain. What are the sources of nanoparticles in this city, Mexico City? Well, emissions from internal combustion engines burning fossil fuels. In this particular city, we have tons and tons of unregulated diesel cars, and you go behind one of those trucks and you get a headache in absolutely 5 seconds. And those are responsible for total regional and urban Mexico City pollution. We should emphasize that these big, heavy diesel vehicles are unregulated in the city. We also have fixed sources like factories. Electronic waste is an amazing source of nanoparticular material that penetrate your brain. I'm going to show you some pictures about that. And then we also have tons and tons of nanomaterials in the food we eat every day. An example of that will be titanium oxide. We use them in the cosmetics that we apply to our faces every day, to the sunscreen to protect our skin, And we use them, of course, in the pharmaceutical and medical applications. This is a complicated little cartoon, but I want you to remember that nanoparticles penetrate in your body through your conjunctiva, your nose, your tongue, obviously through your respiratory tract, very effective way to inhale and reach every single part of your body. And we swallow particles as well. So the GI tract is a perfect way to bring the particles to your intestine, and then through your intestine, they can travel to your brainstem. Let me show you a couple pictures of electron microscopy where we can see the particles. We can locate them precisely in your organelles of your brain cells, and then we can tell what kind of metals they are associated with them. This will be a mitochondria. This paper was published in 2020. And in this particular mitochondria, these two particles have iron and have titanium. And in this other picture, this is a neuroenteric sample from a resident in Mexico City, and this neuroenteric material is present in your small bowel. Now, these are nanorods of titanium, and the only source for those nanorods is electronic waste. Now, in a similar paper published in 2020, we have a measurement of magnetic nanoparticles in the substantia nigra, in the tectum, and in the cerebellum. And the substantia nigra, which is a target of dopaminergic cells for the Parkinson disease, accumulates huge amounts of nanoparticles. And so is the cerebellum. So the cerebellum perhaps will be the highest structure in the brain that accumulates magnetic particles. So why are we worried about environmental nanoparticles in your brain? Well, first of all, because are ubiquitous. You are in contact with the nanoparticles since you are in utero. The nanoparticles cross all biological barriers, including the placenta. They reach all cells and every organelle. They cause oxidative damage, and magnetic nanoparticles are particularly harmful. For health purposes, it is critical to understand entry routes and profiles of nanoparticles capable of crossing different barriers. Toxic nanoparticles are typically smaller, inorganic in nature, and water insoluble, and toxicity appears linked to exposure dose and frequency. When we analyze, and this is a very short list, the literature is very extensive, how the nanoparticles could potentially damage the brain, the major pathways will be oxidative damage with the formation of free radicals, direct damage of membrane organelles, an interference with metabolic processes, mutations of DNA, and then a series of mechanisms that are synergistic and cause significant damage in the cell, such as apoptosis, autophagy, immune responses, neuroinflammation, which is very striking in people living in high polluted areas, and brain-blood barrier damage. Now, let's talk a bit about the magnetic damage, because that is a bit different from the others. The magnetic particles are capable of producing heat in response to magnetic fields. And we are also surrounded by magnetic fields. We carry our powerful cell phones, we are in a Wi-Fi environment, etc., etc., etc. And so those particles, those magnetic particles can move, can produce heat, and therefore the damage could also be extensive. This is a cartoon from one of our papers to show you the neurovascular unit, and something interesting, the nanoparticles travel in red blood cells and erythrocytes, and those can be carried to any portion of your body. In this particular cartoon, this is a blood vessel within the brain, and you can observe the transfer of the nanoparticles from the red blood cell to the endothelial cell and then to the neurovascular unit. Also notice that the nanoparticles can travel within the neuron and go from one neuron to the next. And this traveling could be retrograde or anterograde. Now, why we as physicians are so concerned about this? Well, because we're observing alterations, structural alterations in the MRIs, brain MRIs of young children, and then progressively worse as the people remain in this city. So this is an example of an MRI in an 10-year-old boy. And what you see here is what we call, the neuroradiologists call, hyperintense lesions, and they are associated with vascular lesions in areas like the frontal lobe. This will be an extreme of the pathology we see. This is a 45-year-old female with extensive atrophy that goes from the frontal to the parietal and to the occipital regions. This person did not have any genetic factor of risk. It was exposed at work to high levels of PM2.5 and lived in one of the most polluted areas in Mexico City. So exposure to air pollutants has been associated with the most common neurodegenerative fatal diseases, affecting millions and millions of people across the world: Alzheimer's and Parkinson. To date, nanoparticles remain an underexplored environmental toxicant in the development of common neurodegenerative diseases. Neural damage and neuropathology could depend on the nanoparticle characteristics, your genetic susceptibility, comorbidities, and the differential access and targets achieved via their portals of entry. So Alzheimer's disease starts in childhood in polluted metropolitan Mexico City. We have documented that, we have published about the topic, and we believe that PM2.5 and nanoparticles play a key role in the development of neuroinflammation in these highly exposed individuals. A serious health crisis is in progress with social, educational, judicial, economic, and overall negative health impact for the 21.8 million residents in this city. Where do you live? What air pollutants you're exposed to? What you're inhaling and swallowing from the air you breathe? What you eat? How you travel? And your occupational long life history are key. Control of nanoparticle sources become critical. Alzheimer's disease is preventable in the scenario of air pollution exposures. So what do we need to do as researchers? We need to characterize the ultrafine particle exposures in urban pollutions. We desperately need to quantify and characterize MPs, nanoparticle concentrations, composition, size, shape, and location in neural cells in specific brain target areas in exposed individuals. why somebody gets Alzheimer's, and why somebody else gets Parkinson, and why somebody else gets frontotemporal dementia, and why somebody presents data from the different diseases at the same time. That is our main concern, and research has to be done on those aspects. We need working hypotheses establishing the association between nanoparticles and neuropathology hallmarks, taking into account there is a considerable overlap between misfolded protein pathologies. And important, we need support from multidisciplinary groups and resources to do the research. So next time you want to donate towards research in Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease or frontotemporal dementia or ALS, please donate directly to the universities and the researchers that are working on the topic. You don't want your money to go to CEOs that make $1.4 million a year and have 14% of your money going to research. We need your support, and you need to know that if you live in a polluted city, and I mentioned megacities and big cities, well, small rural areas can also be exposed to high levels of pollutants. And those cities where there is forest fires every single year expose the residents to a significant amount of effects related to those huge amounts of PM 2.5. So what do we have in Mexico City, which is my example for this presentation? You have olfactory deficits, cognitive deficits, vestibular and auditory alterations, systemic inflammation, definitely brain and heart inflammation, respiratory and cardiovascular morbidity and mortality, and the fatal neurodegenerative diseases for which, very unfortunately, we don't have medications that work. Thank you very much.